Rightio. G'day everyone, Mark Bachmann from Nature Glenelg Trust. I'm probably the odd man out in the room because I did used to work for government for 12 years with the Environment Department here in Mount Gambier until 2 or 3 years ago when I started up this new not-for-profit organisation that's working both sides of the border. So I do feel a little bit like the odd man out, and I'll be referring to some other people's work here, but I do think we're in a unique position to talk about wetlands, and you'll hopefully understand why in a moment. So thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I'm also grateful to the previous speakers for giving me such a great intro and context. So thanks to Jeff and Daryl and others, because one of the reasons that wetlands and ecology is so complicated is that it actually ends up being the product of a whole lot of these other things that are interacting together, and what you see expressed in a wetland at the surface, or as I think Daryl called it, rejected recharge. I think wetlands sounds nicer. No worries. So, in terms of the talk today, an overview, a bit of an introduction, which will explain a bit more about my background, Nature Glenelg Trust and wetlands in the region. Touch on the regulations and policies that influence wetland management with a specific focus on plantations in the southeast. And I was pleased to hear the discussion about scales come up, because I was trying to work out the best way to structure this talk, and thought that a way for me to order my own thoughts about how wetlands interact is looking at these different scales. So I'll go through those, and then finally some concluding remarks. So just a few things flashing up on the screen here, different reports and projects I've been involved in over the years. I guess my involvement with wetlands goes right back to when I first moved down here. If you've got an interest in the environment and you work in the southeast region, you don't really have any excuse not to take an interest in wetlands, because as some of the stats earlier suggested, a large proportion of the region was wetland of some shape or form. So involved in a number of projects in my old role with government, and some of those reports are more recent ones through Nature Glenelg Trust and our consulting work. And so we've been involved in quite a few projects recently for the NRM board and the department in the region, advising on the ecological aspects of wetlands in particular. So I hope that there's a couple of ones up the top there actually that reports I was involved in just before I left the department. A couple of chapters for the South East Science Review as well, and that was quite important for people with an interest in forestry, looking at the accuracy of wetland mapping. I'll touch on that a bit later as well. So just to explain who Nature Glenelg Trust is, or NGTs you'll hear me refer to us, just so you perhaps get a picture of why we're interested in wetlands and why it's perhaps relevant for me to be talking to you today. Our purpose, this is in our deed of trust, basically, like most environmental organisations, there's a key thing there about protecting and restoring habitat. For us, and to make us regionally specific, I guess, we've got a particular emphasis on wetlands, both sides of the border. We're interested in using sound science to enhance management, and that definitely underpins our consulting work when it comes to ecology, conservation-based research, and we're pretty big on involving the community in our work, and you'll see an example of that later too. The way we're set up, which is a little bit different to most not-for-profits who don't necessarily have the second element there, professional consulting services, and we operate under a couple of different trading names, but it's all done under the banner of Nature Glenelg Trust. The reason I put this up is just to explain that it's why we continue to have an involvement in the science and ecology of wetlands, because doing that sort of work actually, it serves us greatly actually, because it means we're keeping our scientific understanding in and that side of things to a high level, which means when we deliver grant-funded project work, we're able to apply that on the ground to the sort of on-ground works and things we're doing like that. The third element is about to get underway, because we've just got our deductible gift recipient status in Canberra, which is pretty exciting, so hopefully some things will happen in that space soon. The region that we work in is a little bigger than the old region I used to work in, for those involved with Natural Resources Southeast. The zone basically between Adelaide and Melbourne is a hotspot, particularly the southern strip of that for wetlands, and so that's an area that we're particularly interested in having an influence. This is our team. It's photos got some staff and committee members in it, but we're based at a number of different locations. We've got a bit of a hub in Warrnambool with a few staff there and a small base here in Mount Gambier at Vansittart Park if anyone wants to pop by. And so yeah, we've got a number of other staff based at home offices around the region as well. We work on all things biodiversity, but we do have a specific focus on wetlands. And the reason for that, I'll get to in a moment. I forgot I put this up here. I guess an expression of that is a project we're working on that was funded a couple of years ago and is partway through, has 3 years to run, federally funded to work on restoring wetlands on private land. And I mention this because it has relevance to the commercial foresters in the room if you'd like to work with us, if you think there are opportunities, and you'll see an example of this later as well. That program operates in the southeast and Glenelg Hopkins NRM regions if you're interested. So why focus on wetlands? Well, in this region, and wherever they occur, they're ecologically significant. In this region, because of the extent of loss, there's certainly a number of threatened species. They provide environmental services. These are things you've probably all heard of. Those sort of functions they provide in our environment. Obviously, they're not bad places to go and enjoy if you get the opportunity as well, so there's definitely wider community benefits. This is not really being investigated to the extent that we would like, but we think there's certainly a carbon storage potential story there as well, particularly in this region where we have a number of peat type wetlands, which is has particularly high levels of carbon. They're highly adaptive ecosystems. This is something that's exciting about working in wetlands as opposed to terrestrial systems. Their restoration potential is really great, and I'll give you a quick example of this just that's visually stunning. Not in a forestry context, but a place that I spent a bit of time in my old job working many years towards seeing restored. This is a property next to Piccaninny Ponds. Before restoration, you'll see the cows there in that image. Cows across here. Within a short number of months after the drains were blocked up, this is a spring-fed system, and you'll just see what happened within a couple of months of re-inundation occurring. Pretty remarkable change. And this next image is 5 years later, around the time the site became a Ramsar wetland, along with the park, the pre-existing park next door. This is the sort of habitat complexity in the wetland that's been able to reform of its own accord without any human intervention. So wetlands have got fantastic recovery potential, and this is now a hotspot for nationally threatened species and other attributes that are really quite significant. And as has been mentioned, a lot of our wetlands have been lost or degraded. So a quick before and after image, this is of that cross-border zone, and we'll have a look at a zoom-in area just in a moment, but just to give you an idea of before and after, I can flick between just to show you the difference a few times. See if you can pick Rocklands. There is a wetland that does appear that wasn't there before, over near the Grampians. Helps nudge the trend in the other direction. And so that trend is that in both sides of the border, actually in the southeast it's more substantial, but the majority of wetlands have been drained. It's 90+% in the southeast and 60+% over the border. Those that do remain are less permanent, and of course there are these other land use influences that are now playing out on remaining wetlands. I thought I'd just quickly run through some photos to give you a taste of what wetlands we have in the southeast. These aren't all in a forestry context. Lake Horden up towards Roe. This is an area with thrombolites, which is pretty stunning, obviously. Rising Springs down on the coast, south of Mount Gambier. Definitely, this is a groundwater expression site. Next door to those images you saw previously at Big Swamp. Bull Lagoon, now the terminus for flows out of the Mosquito Creek catchment. I thought I'd put a couple of images into the property that our organisation purchased late last year up at Eaglehawk Waterhole. This is in that area near Francis, just up towards Bangham. This is a seasonal wetland in a woodland context. There would have been a lot of the southeast look like this pre-drainage. Crabhole country, this is pretty unique stuff. There's a little bit of that on the property up there. So wetlands come in all shapes and sizes. There's also a couple in the lower southeast here which are in a forestry context. This one from Honan Scrub, a more densely vegetated wetland, and this one at the marshes. So just to give you a taste of the range of wetlands we've got. Right, so so that's enough of an introduction. To get into the, I guess, the nitty-gritty of the talk, there's a number of, and look, I don't need to tell you this, if people work in forestry industry, you would know this better than I, because I haven't been on that side of the equation, but there's certainly a number of legislative requirements. At a federal level, there's threatened species legislation. State level, there's all sorts of legislation, including that in the case of the NRM Act, provides for regional regulation and plans to guide what happens, and that was what Tim was talking about previously, obviously. And then, of course, for the industry to have credibility, there's various international and national certification schemes that people are trying to adhere to and have auditors come through to check that they're working towards, and industry guidelines. In the case of South Australia, there's been some around for a few years now. And the way I guess I see it is that those last two are largely shaped by the context that's set by the legislative requirements. But for the talk today, I guess I want to particularly focus, it will come out in the talk that these are the two areas of particular focus. You often cover off on the higher level requirements once you get to the detail of the regional requirements, and in the case of the guidelines in South Australia, which are quite detailed, they cover off on all of these things as well. So jumping to this question and looking at this issue at different scales, we'll start with the big picture, regional scale, and it's at this scale that you've got images there of the water allocation plan and the NRM plan. These are the guiding documents that take the bigger picture stuff and make it theoretically, and I think certainly trying to do our best with this, make it work at the regional scale. So in terms of original wetland extent, you've seen this image. The key points to think about here is that wetlands were extensive, and you've seen from the examples, extremely diverse. They were only a handful of the types of wetlands we had. Now there was a high degree of interaction with water tables that were elevated, and in many places these water tables are indistinguishable with the surface. This is pre-drainage. In some cases this is still the case. And you'll see the overlay here that sort of comes in. You'll see the uplands, the higher, those old stranded dune ridges there, the wetlands in between, but there's arrows there which show that the general direction of surface water movement or all that rejected recharge is trying to head towards the north and the west, and it didn't do so very efficiently, which is why the region was covered by such large areas of water. But when it got a head of steam up and there was enough water backing up around the place, it could even, on occasions, generate a flow into the Coorong through Salt Creek. Very few places where it used to get directly out to the sea, but of course that interaction between aquifers means that there was also a lateral movement subsurface towards the coast, and hence there's a number of ways that water would express itself as you move towards the coast. At the surface in many instances with springs and areas of seepage. So a very leaky landscape, lots of water in it. Imagine a sponge and you just keep on tipping water and there's water pouring out everywhere. That's what the southeast was like. It's a bit hard to imagine now with how we've altered the region. Okay, so you see the change before and after. That's the drainage network in the mid and lower southeast. And as was mentioned earlier, I've just finished reading a book that it's Peter Ryman, I haven't met him, but about Goyder's long lost journal that he found in an antique dealer, and fascinating account how him and William Milne and Goyder were travelling around the region, and every person they talked to was pretty excited about their harebrained idea to drain the region. People talk about Goyder's line up north in South Australia, but perhaps not as many people know that Goyder was one of the key reasons why the southeast was drained, and they were already talking about some of the earliest cuts that they wanted to see happen, and they happened quite soon after that trip in 1863. One up at Salt Creek, some near Kingston, there was a couple near Millicent, and once they started, they've pretty much been digging drains ever since in the southeast. So, major change. As I mentioned earlier, over 90% of wetlands have been lost, and less than 10% are in good condition. And there was some maps earlier. This one I grabbed out of a report from Claire Harding a couple of years ago, just showing what those areas irrigated agriculture, what that looks like in terms of intensity on a map. And these don't correspond. It's interesting how when you overlay these maps, these are areas obviously where the country is now cleared, open to farming, not in the same areas where the forests are generally, although some are interspersed. There has been a trend of increase over recent decades, and I think Jeff mentioned the zone south of Mount Gambier. This is what it looks like. All those, is it 100 centimetres, Jeff?
I think a few more.
A few more? See if you can count them quickly. There's a lot there. This is one of those infrared images which shows you all the circles. Now, a lot of these went in the 90s. I remember when I came down here, I couldn't believe the explosion in irrigation that was going on. It was quite remarkable, and there was certainly some tales of people, anecdotal stories about the local effects some of these pivots are having on nearby bores or springs and things like that the minute they turn on. About that story of lateral connectivity, I suppose, that someone was asking about earlier. And of course, state irrigation underpins a number of important industries, and I think some people will be talking about this afternoon. That's where the forestry is, so you probably don't need me to tell you which colours are which. Interestingly, the pine areas now these areas were often planted, they were cleared to be planted with pines, which is a distinguishing thing between them and blue gums. But as you'll see a bit later, the habitats that were cleared weren't necessarily equivalent, or tall forests or what have you. They were a mixture of habitats, woodlands, heathlands and other. These tend to be sandy areas that themselves are interspersed with swamps because of elevated water tables and interaction with groundwater and surface water. But they do tend to be on higher ground. You'll notice there with the drainage overlay that they're not necessarily in areas directly connected to drains. In some cases they are, in some cases they've got small drains within them, but they're not necessarily directly connected in the same way to the large arterial network in the region. Blue gums, on the other hand, much more recently established. These are areas that were planted over farmland that had been converted from a lot of it, not as recently as I guess the 40s, 50s onwards. But these areas have also been drained by that comprehensive arterial drainage, so there's a difference there as well. It's obviously different, slightly different soils and different location in the region. And you've seen another version, well, the longer term version of this map, just showing that the effect of that recent change caused by those wattle range blue gum plantings. So summing up that regional picture, in terms of wetlands, surface groundwater, how you tell the difference between them in some places, look, they're equally vital to wetlands, although they do, depending on the reliance and on when you go and see a wetland, it will be expressed in different ways, which does make this confusing. Drainage has by far, as you have seen, been the biggest regional influence on wetland extent at that big picture scale. But there are other factors that are important, and they were highlighted as we looked at this. And the one I haven't mentioned, but Jeff touched on, is climate, and this, of course, is the one that confounds everything when we're trying to work out what's going on. So Mother Nature just doesn't deliver the rainfall conveniently for our experiments, unfortunately. So coming down now to the neighbourhood scale, this one I think is quite interesting. And again, this is the scale that the policy is looking to be implemented at, I guess. Tim's talk certainly talked about implementing actions that aim to have an influence at this scale. I thought I'd go to an example not far from here, just as you drive towards Cassidy on the Glenelg Highway, after you've turned off at the racecourse. You might even have seen a road out there called Black Swamp Road. Good luck if you can find Black Swamp anymore. As you'll see in these images, it's quite interesting the change that this area has undergone. So there's a number of wetlands dotted through this area in the earliest diagram that was drawn in 1882. By 1950, a large portion had been converted to plantation. I noticed there's some fantastic old diagrams out there on the table if you want to look at them after that show when this area was being planted in, I think it was 1929, 1930. At least south of that road they were, by government. Black Swamp was planted around at that stage, and there were still some areas of bush you can see there that were on the cards. By 1978, it's pretty much all been converted, and Black Swamp itself has been planted, or been prepared to be planted. You'll still notice the odd wet patch there on the right, but by the time we get to the present day, this landscape's been dried out to the extent that the first rotation wetlands that were planted around or were non-viable because the trees were flooded have basically been planted through. And that's the overlay, just showing where all those original wetlands were, and you'll see if we take them away that obviously not much there to speak of anymore. So there's been quite a significant change in this location. Now this is another interesting case study. This is actually a shot taken out on a property I own just over the border, but not far from that sort of Penola, Nangwarry forest areas is near Lake Mundy. This is actually the after shot, but this is to show you what a lot of the areas in that Tarpeen and Nangwarry area used to look like. It wasn't forest. It was, if you look at the original surveyor diagrams, there was a lot of heathland out there, and you'll notice there aren't too many trees there. This is the before shot, just to give you an idea of how different. If you can imagine this completely covered with pines, we're obviously talking about a very different type of landscape when you convert heathland to pine country. Now these are ones that have volunteered themselves thanks to yellowtails dropping cones out there and things like that. And so that's the before, that's the after, but I thought it was good to show it in reverse just to give you an idea that when you convert heathland to forest, you are changing the water balance of that country significantly. And I wanted to put this in because it's not to diminish the argument that in some cases we've replaced forest with forest, but just remember that the southeast was not uniformly forest, and a lot of it was wet and it was heathy and it was open. That in a lot of places we've actually replaced a low water use environment with a very high water use environment by converting to plantation. No worries. And thankfully the early surveyors did us the favour of actually drawing this down on maps. So this is just north of this is actually up in that country that we've been referring to a few times, up in that Nangwarry area. And I've colour coded this to show you where different features were. In 1883 this was mapped as a swamp and open. All this country here was mapped as open heath, like that country I just showed you. Now if we come forward, fast forward to the present day, the majority of this image has been converted to plantation. This area here is that's a heritage agreement bushland, which is being invaded by pines on one side, unfortunately, in the heathland. The heathland's also being invaded by other tree, native tree species as well. The wetland's still there, but this wetland, I've never seen water in it, and I don't know that anyone would have in recent decades because it's influenced by that wider trend that we heard earlier. This is an area where water tables were interacting with the surface pre-European settlement. Fast forward to the present day with the change in that Nangwarry area and the amount of pine, water tables are down by enough that a wetland like this no longer interacts with the water table and doesn't have the right attributes to be a wetland anymore. So, summing up this scale, wetlands that rely on both surface water and groundwater can be influenced by plantations at this scale. The catch is these impacts aren't uniform, and there are places that I could show you where wetlands are still interacting with the water table in a plantation context. Think the Mount Bur Range, the marshes, that area, for instance. And this is where these confounding factors come in. Depends on the soil type, depth of groundwater, wetland hydrology. There's some places, for instance, where the water table's up, there's wetlands pockmarked through a landscape, you drop the water table, some of them have clay bases, so if you get a heavy rainfall year, you still see water in some wetlands, but those that are sandy based, when the water table drops, you don't see water in them again. All these confounding factors. Perched aquifer Mount Bur Range has a different influence than other parts of the region where we've seen a uniform trend of change in the other direction. And as Tim mentioned, there's special policy protection for a certain number of particular wetlands. I'll just put the list up quickly, but flick through these because they've already been mentioned, and those setback distances are listed there that have been calculated for these. Right, at the site-specific scale, I just wanted to give a quick example that shows how, at this scale, and this is these guidelines that were prepared a few years ago, and a useful document for guiding people working in plantations, not just in South Australia really, because some of the principles apply across the board. But it's at this scale that you sort of work out, you know, how do we turn best practice into managing wetlands on the ground? This is that operational level. This is where the question of how wetlands are mapped is important, and we had an imperfect starting point in the southeast because when the policy came along it grabbed a data set in the South Australian Wetland Inventory database that wasn't perfect, and it needs to be corrected as areas are looked at, but it was the best that we had, so that was what was referred to. And this idea of buffer zones comes into effect at the site-specific scale, and in that policy document they talk about different setbacks depending on the value of the wetland feature. Having said that, this case study is interesting. This was presented at a workshop I went to a couple of years ago by Forestry SA, and they're advocating a variable approach which allows for increased protection for some wetlands, grading through to ones that have no values that can be ascertained to arguably no buffers at all. And it actually has, I think it has quite a bit of merit because it means that you can more sensitively manage wetlands. Some of those ones that are mapped at the bottom may not be a wetland anymore in this context, even though they're marked as one. The ones that, when you've gone and assessed a site, you can make sure that more important wetlands get a more sensitive level of management. And a quick case study of this is from over the border, a site that we've worked at, owned by Macquarie Forestry, where they were open to us running a restoration trial. Now this has got the benefit of having a drain pass through the site, and there's water that can be managed and manipulated to benefit this wetland. Location of the trial structure we put in to actually reinstate hydrology. This was earlier, a couple of months ago this year. Amazing what you can do in a day with a dozen volunteers. And this has been the background image for the talk, so that's what Walker Swamp looks like. But Macquarie have been great to work with on this trial, and it's an example of how at the site-specific scale, depending on the circumstances, and the circumstances over there are a little bit different to here, but there are things that can be done to manage wetlands more sensitively in a plantation context. This is a blue gum area. That's the team, community involvement. So summing up the site-specific scale, my theory is, I mean, this might seem like a bit of a bleak talk. I didn't know how to give a talk about wetlands and plantations without talking about the facts, because the facts are what they are. The reason I started up this NGO was so we could get on with trying to do positive things, and so it is what it is. And my theory is let's make the best of what we've got. And due to that wider picture, things have changed that we can't necessarily control, but and where some of those factors are outside your control, the approach that Forestry SA have been employing, looking at classifying wetlands is a really great start. And where we actually still have water to play with, there are lots of things we can do, because within the forestry context there are a number of drained wetlands as well. And a quick case study in Forestry SA country that was done a few years ago by forestry staff, another small trial, Brooksby's Lane in Mount Burr. This channel that was dug decades ago, the wetland, this wetland here, basically, in spite of the attempt to convert it to plantation, never quite took hold and remained a wetland. So rather than fight against it, there's this small trial sandbag structure in there which is holding back a bit of water. Doesn't look like a lot, but a drain that's constantly running removes a lot of water from the site. And in the case of this site, you'll notice these blackwoods that have been creeping down the slope as a result of that trial are now turning up their toes. Occasionally we can be happy about seeing native species die. Because what happens in a wetland when it dries out is you get terrestrialisation, trees, shrubs move in. When you do the reverse, it looks a little uglier, of course, but the end result is a more functional wetland. Right, so finishing up. In spite of everything I've said, because I hope it hasn't come across as being too negative, actually the irony is at a big picture scale, forestry is actually probably one of the more sensitive neighbours for conservation. It provides a softer edge, particularly for areas of bushland. The catch is that you've got risks that are also associated with that, and pine wildlands are a key one. That if they're not managed, you can end up with what looks like plantation on the bushland side of the fence. So if that's managed, then plantation is actually a pretty good neighbour, because it's a lot less weedy and provides, in terms of grassy weeds and other impacts. So edge effects aren't as great when you're in a plantation context. The wetland issues are tricky because they can't always be addressed at the site-specific scale. That's why we have this regional policy stuff, and that's why there is a place for it in this region, because the impacts are undeniable. But in the southeast there are still confounding factors, and it's complicated, as we know. Not every, you'll always find an exception. Everyone, well, what about this site? Yes, I know, there's always an exception. Please don't ask those questions. But, let's get on with it, let's work together. There's great potential. I know there's some sites out there and where we can help reverse the trend that has occurred, and let's find the places where we can back a few winners, because, there are positive things we can do. My contact details are there if you'd like to get in touch. Thank you.